Three, two, one. Hello, and welcome to the second half of session one of Doing Business in Today's China. As you'll recall, in the first session, we introduced how we think about doing business in China today. We approach this as a broad spectrum of ideas. We need to think a little bit about history and culture. We certainly need to think about China, the structure of it, as we often think of it as a monolithic entity, one nation that's run by a centrally controlled system. But as we introduced in the first session, it's also balanced by a very decentralized system of provinces, municipalities, and townships that are very, very diverse in how they contribute to the growth of China today and to the geopolitical landscape and the economic landscape that China occupies. We also think of it as the manufacturer for the world and a very powerful economic system to be dealt with in the global economy. And we think about China's growing geopolitical role and what that means throughout. And you'll remember that we also introduced the philosophy and the learning outcomes of our teaching. We like to focus a little bit on culture and history. And as I mentioned in the first session, this isn't a history course or a culture course, but in order to gain a deep appreciation for how we think of China, we need to dive a little bit into that. And so in this session, we're going to do that. And then we're going to follow that up in session two, and a little bit in session three with focusing on China's political economy. And we'll get to some very interesting and important conversations about that as we go forward. But for now, let's talk about China's history, a brief history. And we put brief in quotation marks here because this is actually a very long history, and we're going to run through it very quickly, just highlighting some of the things that we think are important for understanding this particular system. So what do we want to touch on when we think of this brief history? And we often begin by asking people the question, when you think about China, what comes to mind? And people will talk about pollution. They will talk about the world's most populous, and maybe now is it second most populous nation in the world. We think about this rising geopolitical economy. But we want to take a step back. We want to think about culture and focus on a few historical moments. So we're not going to do a deep overview of culture, but we're going to talk about a couple of key things in the next few minutes. We're going to talk a bit about Confucianism and China's deep history. We're going to talk about China's position in the world for a long time as the Middle Kingdom. Indeed, the word China itself means middle nation, 中国. We're also going to talk very briefly about China's post-Ming period and what eventually emerged during the Qing dynasty as the century of humiliation. And then we're going to talk very briefly about the communist era, although the communist era will also lead into our discussion of the political economy in China today. Okay, so let's dive in. And I'd like you to sit back for a moment and watch this short video and think about what things jump out at you as you're watching this long history boiled down into just a few minutes. Here we go. So what did you notice there? Hopefully one of the things that jumped out is just the very long historical timeline here. We began with the Shah dynasty some 4,000 plus years ago. And then we saw this video march through a number of different things that capture China. We saw some of the great innovations: paper making, the printing press, gunpowder. We saw the century of humiliation. We saw the communist revolution. We saw the emergence of global manufacturing after the transition from Mao Zedong to Deng Xiaoping. We eventually saw China's entry into the WTO in 2001 and the emergence of China as a high-tech powerhouse, creating such great unicorns as Alibaba and Tencent, which was the founder of WeChat, and on and on. But what we want to give you here is just a sense of this length of time and the multiple phases that China has gone through. Now, in focusing on culture, we like to focus on historical moments, and I'm going to talk very briefly about a few here. We're going to talk a little bit about Confucianism, a little bit about the Middle Kingdom, the century of humiliation, and the communist era again. So what do we see as we go through this? Let's first talk about Confucianism in the Middle Kingdom. So Confucius was born in 551 BCE, so over 2,500 years ago. And Confucius was a thinker that molded Chinese society in many ways, in ways that would last for 2,000 years. If you fast forward to the period of the beginning of the Chinese dynastic rule, you find figures like the philosopher Han Fei, who was a big proponent of the notion of rule by law and the idea that leaders need to have centralized control. Of course, you need a legal system, but emperors really, in the end, get to decide what's going to happen in the world. And then the first Chinese emperor was Qin Shi Huangdi in 221 BCE. And there's an interesting saying in China that certainly goes back many 1,000 to 2,000 years probably. But it's also a concept that maybe even applies today when we think about this balance between the center in Beijing and the provinces and municipalities and townships. And that saying is Tianga Huangdi Yu, which means the mountains are high and their emperor is far away. Yes, there's a very powerful emperor in China, but that person resides a long way away. And so we can continue to be innovative and develop our part of the world as we see fit. And we think that that applied 1,000 years ago in China, and we think it still applies today. And we'll get more into that when we start talking about the political economy of China. Now, let's talk about this period from the beginning of Imperial China up to, say, 1400. This was a period in which China really did view itself, and in many ways it was the center of the world. It was the Middle Kingdom. If you look at a Chinese map, you'll find China in the middle, and you'll find lots of ancillary other kingdoms, or what would become nations, surrounding it. This is what a Chinese map looked like back then, and this is where China's name, the Middle Kingdom or the Middle Country, comes about. So what was happening during this time period? We saw great innovations in things like paper making. We saw silk. We saw the printing press. Gutenberg is also often in Europe is credited with the invention of the printing press, but the Chinese invented it hundreds of years before. We saw gunpowder, an invention that radically changed the world in the era of colonialism. This was invented in China. the nautical compass, which also radically changed the world in the era of colonialism. Again, a Chinese invention. So China wasn't just occupying about a third of the global GDP by the time the Ming Dynasty comes around, but China was also far and away the most innovative economy in the world for many, many, many centuries. One interesting comparison we often like to talk about is, so 1405, King Henry V was put in position as the King of England. And he wanted to have a party, and he invited 6,000 people. And they didn't have enough resources at the time to give people porcelain plates, but they had people served on stale bread so that they could serve all of their guests. Around that same time, Emperor Yongle, who was the third Ming emperor, was opening up the Forbidden City in Beijing, and he wanted to have a party too. So he invited 24,000 of his friends, and those who couldn't make it from distant places, he sent his armada out to pick them up and bring them. And they inaugurated the Forbidden City, which was the new landing place and would become the centerpiece of Chinese imperial rule for many, many hundreds of years. Another interesting comparison that we often like to think about, when King Henry V was inaugurating his reign, he borrowed 6 books from a monastery because he wanted to be able to show his library. At the same time, Emperor Yongle, when he was launching the Forbidden City, launched the Yongle Dadian, which was, until the founding of Wikipedia, the largest encyclopedia the world had ever seen. 24,000 volumes, manuscripts. It was an amazing, amazing show of knowledge and power. And again, if you just sort of think of that comparison, that kind of gives you a sense of where China was when it was at the height of its powers in 1400. This was also a period of an admiral in the Ming Dynasty called Admiral Zheng He. Zheng He had far and away the largest armada in the world. If you think about Columbus setting sail in 1492, he set sail with ships that were the height of maritime technology in Europe. 3 90-foot ships, 3 mast ships, which are the height of maritime technology at the time in Europe. Admiral Zheng He would typically set sail with a fleet of 400 ships, usually about, some of them 400 feet in length, 9-mast ships, which was maritime technology Europe wouldn't see for centuries. So again, the comparison here, the most powerful economy in the world and also the most powerful armada. This is how China saw itself in the 1400s. And this was a time when China dominated global trade. Admiral Zheng He would typically set sail in the years from 1405 to 1424 and navigate the South China Seas and Africa and the Middle East and the Central East. And of course, these hooked up with Marco Polo's Silk Road during the time period. And so we have this sense that, you know, today, as China's building the Belt and Road Initiative, which we're going to talk about later, you know, there was a time when China had already positioned itself as this leader of global trade. Now, in 1424, Emperor Yongle died suddenly, and he had no heir. And so there was an interesting debate about what would happen within the Ming court. The Ming court was used to receiving countries to come and pay homage to the emperor, and they wanted to continue to do so. But there was a very strong emphasis on the Confucian scholarly elite, and they sort of won the battle that they would no longer navigate the seas. Under Admiral Zheng He, they would sort of shut that down, and actually became a capital offense to build ocean-going vessels shortly thereafter. And China turned inward. It built a wall, and it really kind of closed down this period of exploration. Now, if you think about that as the early period of colonization in that Europe was about to embark on, at that time, China, if they would have gone a similar direction, would have dominated the globe. But they chose to turn inward, and that would define China for the next several hundred years. China would become less innovative, less of a centerpiece of the global political economy in terms of global GDP, and eventually Europe would rise. And so that's the period that we want to look back on. We want to kind of think through what this meant for how to think of China in the global political economy during this time period. The reason we think this is important is, again, when you think about culture of a nation, you have to think about its history. You have to think about what it means for a country like America to start off as colonies and then go through a war of independence. And that history very much defined America's mindset that probably still lasts through today. Similarly with China, the image of China in a Chinese person's mind's eye certainly goes back to this notion of China once being the most dominant nation on the planet. Here's an interesting example of culture in action. And we like to think about this just because we like to think about the ways in which people communicate and discuss things. When I was working at Apple, we would often do this experiment because I would be trying to teach Apple executives how to talk to their Chinese counterparts. And Apple is a fundamentally American company, and so it's imbued with a lot of American culture. And at Apple, we would talk a lot about what the culture of Apple was. So we would talk about words like debate and challenge and disagree and argue. And all of these in Apple's mindset were good words. It was wonderful if you were raising young leaders to debate and challenge and disagree and argue. If you had a young rising star who tended to sugarcoat things, not so good, right? That's not how you take the Steve Jobs imprimatur and fight for your ideas. Now, it's very interesting, and I would often talk with Apple's executives about this. In Chinese, the Chinese dictionary is different than an English dictionary. In English dictionary, you can look up a word and find noun, verb, adjective, adverb. In Chinese, you look up a word and you'll find a label of if it's a good word, a bad word, a middle word, neutral, or a bad word. And I would often go through this exercise because I thought it laid out some very interesting ideas about the ways in which culture plays out in everyday life. So again, the Apple and maybe American mindset would say debate, good. Challenge people, good. Disagreement, good. Arguing, good. Sugarcoating, not so good. It's not a very direct thing. Now, if you go through a Chinese dictionary, here's what you'll find. Debate is a neutral word. It's okay. Challenge people, not a good word at all. Disagreement, not a good word. Argument, not a good word. Sugarcoat, though, 含蓄, is actually a wonderful word in Chinese, and it harkens back to Confucius culture, right? So if you're somebody who engages in dialogue and you use 含蓄, 含蓄 means to make the person across the table from you feel better, right? So cover what you're saying a little bit with sugary content or sugary words, and you're a moral person, right? And so it gives you a sense of just the differences. We talk about this deep history and Confucianism, but these things still are alive today in language. So that was our focus on Confucianism in the Middle Kingdom. Now let's focus a little bit on the century of humiliation in the communist era. This is going to be very short because particularly with respect to the communist era, we're going to talk about much broader implications of this era for China's political economy today, but I think it's worth talking about. So we just mentioned this notion that China was the dominant economy in the world in 1424, 1/3 of the global GDP, far and away the largest armada with the highest technology. in military technology and the most innovative economy in the world as well. But then it turned inward. And by the time we get to 1842, China was facing a colonizing Europe that was much more powerful than the adversary it was facing 400 years earlier. 1842 is a really important period because in 1839, the opium trade was very, very, it was a big trading deal for the Dutch East India Trading Company. They were making a lot of money selling opium into China. And at some point in the 1830s, the Chinese emperor said, we don't want this anymore. No more opium in China. And there was a war. Britain went to war with China over the right to sell a drug in China. We had what was a very brutal war for China. The Chinese lost the war. Britain won. And China was forced to allow for the sale of opium to continue in China. And China was also forced to give up its crown jewel, Hong Kong. And so this was a very, very painful period, and it unleashed what in China today is known as the century of humiliation, Bainan Guochi. So this wasn't just the first Opium War, it was also the second Opium War. It was the Sino-Japanese War of 1895. It was the fall of the Qing Dynasty in 1911. And then horrible things that just sort of seemed like China was in chaos. There was the rape of Nanking in 1937. And so it was just a very, very bad and difficult period for China. And again, this is something that from a cultural perspective, you might not think of this type of history as culture, but when we talk about culture, we're talking about those historical moments that reside in people's minds and shape the way they see the world. And then, of course, by the end of the century of humiliation, we see the communist victory, right? So the Mao's communists won the communist revolution, and we see the emergence of Mao Zedong during this period and the beginning of the communist era, which would begin in 1949. So here again, this has just been a quick introduction to culture. We like to talk about culture by focusing on historical moments. We've touched on Confucianism, but also more centrally, the idea of China as the Middle Kingdom, its power during this period, and then the inward turn starting in 1424, and then China's decline relative to other nations like European nations, and then eventually the century of humiliation and the rise of communism in China. And does anybody remember the phrase? 名高皇帝远,天高皇帝远, right? And so heaven is high and the emperor is far away. Okay. So that's what we'd like to talk about as we go through this. While we move or pivot for our next discussion, I'd like to call in our China team. Now, remember, our China team, the OGL China team, is comprised of myself, but also 3 residents of China, one of whom is Diane Long, who was raised in America but moved to China in 1986 and has been there ever since. And then there's Dashao Chen and Chris Gao. Dashao and Chris are native Chinese. And so I'd love to hear responses from what the team thinks of how things are going in China today and how much culture matters. In particular from Dashao and Chris, I'd love to hear if we've got the reflections on how much these deep historical, but also the century of humiliation matter for how children are taught in school and how people think about things in China every day. And from Diane, who's been a representative of large corporations in China and has thought a lot about the ways in which you do business negotiations. I'd love to hear if in what ways culture matters when you're sitting across the table from a Chinese counterpart. And with that, China team. Thank you. And that's the end of the first session of our workshop, Doing Business in Today's China. Okay, see you in the next session.